Well, here we go then. Coverage of Hogwarts Legacy was delayed owing to Warner Brothers wanting us to analyse Day 1 code, then delayed once again when a new patch arrived promising performance upgrades. Content delayed in order to deliver analysis that accurately represents the game in the, dare I say it, here and now. And this is a state of affairs made that much more difficult by the sheer wealth of performance modes in the console versions of the game. Suffice it to say, there's a lot going on here in this one. But over and above the technical minutiae, Avalanche Studios' overall vision here is remarkably well realised. Franchise origins come from the books, of course, but the game leans very much into the movie aesthetic, and let's be honest, movie tie-ins have a poor track record. Often produced on tight deadlines with dated technology, movie tie-ins tend to underwhelm. Hogwarts Legacy is a very notable exception, however, a massive open-world game with beautiful visuals, clearly reaping the benefits of a 6-year development cycle. For those invested in the world of Harry Potter as depicted in the movies, it's hard not to be impressed with this release. At the same time, repeated delays may suggest a slightly rocky production period, and as impressive as the ambition and the technology are behind this game, there's no denying that there are considerable performance issues and bugs. So I guess the question is this: if we've got the visual spectacle, the scale and the scope, do we have the consistency and the polish necessary to bring the whole package together? So Hogwarts Legacy's defining visual accomplishment is its remarkable recreation of Hogwarts itself. Everything comes together beautifully to make each space look very convincing. Gothic architecture dominates most of these buildings, with vaulted ceilings, broad arches and clean stonework, all modelled with a very impressive level of detail. From a distance, everything looks intricately detailed and free of polygonal blockiness, but the game also impresses when you get right up close. All the assets maintain good enough geometric density to withstand point-blank scrutiny, and the texturing is consistently high resolution and free of visually obvious tiling or other annoyances. Those high ceilings are put to good use to create dramatic lighting setups to make sure the interiors look their best. Light spills in from elevated windows, flooding through each space in a visually convincing way. Hogwarts Legacy relies heavily on baked lighting here, though the final results in static indoor spaces are often quite impressive, with rich lighting throughout. Hogsmeade, the nearby town, is also impressively well realised. The buildings have a stylised character with sloping roofs and vertically stretched proportions. Inside, the same exacting attention to detail is very much apparent. Distinctively decorated shops offer potions, sweets, wands and toys, strewn with unique assets and cast with a bold visual flair. Fans of the film franchise will recognise a lot of this instantly, as key areas from the movies seem to have been replicated very closely in-game. The areas in and around Hogwarts are a real treat visually, and fans in particular will get a lot of mileage out of this fidelity to the source material. Outside of the Hogwarts area itself, there is an open world space to explore, with abundant detail, foliage and a few key settlements along the way. Technically, this is all well managed stuff. Grass is grounded to the environment with screen space shadows, and pop-in is relatively unobtrusive. Lighting at night tends to look a bit flat, but daytime scenes often look sharp and exciting. The actual size of the open world is fairly limited, clocking in at around 3 square miles or so, but it seems reasonably dense with unique natural formations and villages. Plus, most of the game area can be traversed from the air by broomstick as well, with world detail still holding up for the most part. Unfortunately, flying is a relatively sedate, slow affair, possibly a trade-off to keep CPU demands in check, with all broomsticks sharing the same limited base speeds. I'm kind of reminded of traversal in Gotham Knights, also based on the same Unreal Engine technology. Character rendering is another high point. NPCs have a good amount of facial detail and exhibit realistic skin shading. They have a kind of semi-stylized look and often exhibit slightly exaggerated facial proportions, but it works well within the game's visual language. Facial animation does tend to be a bit of a mixed bag, but that's perhaps not unexpected given the high volume of lip-synced animation here. The various facial poses do look fairly expressive at least, so the emotion contained in each performance usually comes out, albeit slightly awkwardly at times. Combat is also exciting from a visual perspective. Particle effects fly thick and fast while you fend off large groups of enemies. Errant casts will sometimes destroy barrels or other incidental environmental objects, which is a satisfying touch. I'd say that the combat is a bit less compelling from a gameplay perspective, but visually it often comes together quite nicely. There are a handful of novel visual touches as well that help bring the world to life. The in-game paintings are animated, playing out little moving dioramas, just as they do in the source movies. Most of these are based on looping video files, though some are represented using real-time 3D or 2D animation. The effect is convincing overall, though you will notice a lot of repeated paintings on close inspection. Pre-computed large-scale animation is also present in a number of scenes, used for building destruction, but most notably to represent certain world-shifting magical effects, which often look quite impressive. So overall, it's clear that Hogwarts Legacy is a very visually accomplished title, but it does have some notable graphical issues as well, I'd say. The lighting is mostly successful, but it can exhibit some odd properties. A lot of interior spaces have bold direct lighting that isn't shadow casting, with shadowing handled through screen space effects. Shadow maps may not always be the best solution, but their near complete absence in some situations does look kinda odd. Hogwarts Legacy relies heavily on a detailed ambient occlusion pass for ambient shading, which produces good results in stills. In motion, does tend to look a bit messy at times though, as it presents serious disocclusion issues around dynamic objects and at the corners of the screen. This is obviously an issue across quite a few games, but it tends to be especially noticeable here as the AO coverage is quite extensive. The game also indulges in some dramatic lighting during dialogue sequences. Characters tend to get a full 3-point lighting setup to highlight their faces, regardless of the environmental lighting in any given scene. There's nothing wrong with this sort of approach if used carefully, but the mismatch often looks a bit bizarre in this game, as backgrounds often have lighting that have zero resemblance to the characters. Reflections also exhibit some unusual problems. In Hogwarts Legacy's default visual modes, reflections are handled using the typical mix of screen space reflections and cube maps that we tend to see in most modern titles. On many water surfaces though, the water surface takes on a very different appearance when the SSR information is occluded. On water during the daytime, tilting the camera down exposes an extremely bright water surface underneath, even if a large structure or rock formation should be blocking out the sun. On top of that, I'd say there are plenty of unintended visual issues. These run the gamut from problems with texture flickering, fog effects popping up in interior spaces, and light bleeding. Lighting transitions between areas aren't handled especially gracefully either, with obvious and distracting pop-in at times. These aren't too distracting for the most part, but they do make the game feel slightly unpolished at times, despite its overall visual fidelity. So, Hogwarts Legacy is a pretty daunting game to cover from a Digital Foundry perspective, simply by virtue of how many different performance mode variations there are. 1, 2, 3 different game modes, par for the course you might say. For this game though, we're looking at a total of 5 different visual modes on Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5, paired back to a more manageable 3 on Series S, plus an additional modifier we'll talk about in a moment. But let's start by taking a detailed look at just one console first of all, Xbox Series X, and we're going to use that as a jumping off point to discuss the other platforms. Okay, so Series X has 3 modes that are available for users attaching their console to a 60Hz display. There's a performance mode, a fidelity mode, and a fidelity with ray tracing mode. Performance option averages out at about 1440p resolution, though according to information supplied by developer Avalanche, it can range from 50% to 80% on each axis of a 4K output, depending on GPU load. The internal rendering resolution is then upscaled for that 4K output using FSR1, AMD's older spatial upscaler, which is used across all modes on all consoles. Tends to lend textures a bit of a painterly appearance and gives vegetation a slightly messy resolve, but it's generally inoffensive in terms of image quality. The performance mode targets 60 frames per second as you may expect, though on Series X in particular it's very shaky. Dropped frames are a near constant annoyance here, alongside deep stutters in more populated areas, and it really doesn't feel stable at all. So yes, to answer the obvious question, the inconsistency can be smoothed out if you have your Series X connected to a display with VRR capabilities, but this only works to a certain extent, and I could still see some of the more substantial stutters even with VRR enabled. Fidelity mode next, and as the name suggests, this boosts pixel count and visual settings in exchange for a lower frame rate target. I'd say we're averaging around 1728p here, which is at the upper end of the 50% to 80% axis resolution DRS range that is also used for this mode. The most notable settings bump here is in improved foliage density, which is obvious in side-by-side comparisons. 30 FPS, that's the target frame rate, and Hogwarts Legacy generally manages to lock pretty reasonably to that target. There are some minor performance hiccups, but it is typically stable at the 30 FPS target. Fidelity with ray tracing is more or less as the name implies. There's a small resolution hit. It averages at about 1440p or so, but this time with a DRS range of 50% to 67% of 4K on each axis. So the visual features are in line with the fidelity mode, and you get RT reflections on top of that. The implementation, unfortunately, isn't anything special, with limited detail and resolution, but at least it doesn't suffer from disocclusion issues. The ray tracing effect also doesn't apply to larger bodies of water, which still rely on screen space reflections. So in theory then, we've traded resolution for an upgrade in fidelity with those ray traced effects, except performance really needs a lot of work here. The game suffers from substantial stutters and big frame rate drops in this particular mode, with readings in the low 20s at worst. Again, areas like Hogsmeade are the worst trouble spot. Now, bearing in mind how heavy that area is on the CPU in the PC version of the game, I do have to wonder if we're CPU limited in this situation. Even so, it's a pretty poor experience at the moment and could stand to use some work. Finally, there are two modes that are only available with the console set to 120Hz output. First off is the balance mode, which targets 40 frames per second with identical visual settings to the fidelity mode, including the same resolution range. The DRS should be a bit more aggressive here, but that's the only concession. Unfortunately, yeah, there is some very significant stuttering here at times, with basically any kind of traversal likely to provoke frame rate drops. Just doesn't work very well at all. The high frame rate performance mode looks a lot like the default performance mode, just a bit softer as it's locked to 1080p resolution, and the general run of play, I'd say it's wildly unstable. At best, a full 120 frames per second is possible, though it's usually hovering between 60 to 90 frames per second or thereabouts. This is definitely one for VRR displays only. Right, so that's 5 modes discussed then, but here's the twist. On both Series X and PlayStation 5 consoles, players can choose to remove the frame rate cap on every mode except the high frame rate performance mode, which is already uncapped and operating at the maximum refresh rate supported by the current gen consoles. In general, the results when uncapping frame rate, pretty unimpressive. You can squeeze an extra 5 to 10 frames per second out of most of these options if you like, compromising a little on consistency for better image response and smoother animation. This only makes any sort of sense on a VRR display, of course, and only when the game consistently falls within the VRR window. It's a curious option to add then, but hey, maybe in the far-flung future when we have next-gen consoles with extra horsepower to spare via backcompat, maybe revisiting these modes with unlocked performance will prove intriguing. As one final caveat before we move on, there are some pre-rendered video files in the game, and these play back at 30 frames per second regardless of visual mode, as you might expect. These are generated in-engine and mostly serve as a way to avoid loading screens, it seems, with comparable visual quality to the real-time graphics. Okay, let's move on then. PlayStation 5 delivers the same visual feature set as Xbox Series X. As confirmed by the developers here, we're looking at the same modes, the same dynamic resolution ranges, the same settings for each mode, and the same frame rate targets. With that said, however, this version offers up a significantly more consistent experience than its Series X counterpart. Performance mode still isn't perfect, but it's nearly locked to 60 frames per second. At worst, it might drop a handful of frames when crossing a challenging loading threshold. The fidelity and fidelity with ray tracing options, on the other hand, do seem to be a locked 30 frames per second. It's very difficult to get them to drop at all. PS5's balance mode is similarly a decent performer, hitting a close to locked 40 frames per second with only rare frame rate drops. The HFR performance mode is more or less a match for Series X though, delivering the same unlocked frame rate range from 60 frames per second upwards. Again, if you feel so inclined, you can unlock the performance of most of the options here as well. The uncapped performance pretty close to Series X, though the PlayStation 5 does have more stable frame rates with less severe fluctuations. Okay then, after that barrage of analysis, we've looked at 10 different performance variations so far, with a bunch of them offering unlocked frame rate alternatives. Well, Xbox Series S puts us back into more familiar territory. The junior console has a cutback set of modes, performance, fidelity and balanced, and visually speaking the key loss is perhaps predictably resolution. The performance mode averages out at about 792p, with fidelity averaging at around 1080p, which is very obvious when put head to head with the premium console equivalents. The performance and balanced modes clock in at pretty similar frame rate figures to Series X, with an unstable turnout overall. The fidelity mode fares somewhat better and mostly manages a consistent 30 FPS, which definitely makes this the best option on Microsoft's pint-sized current-gen console. The unlocked frame rate toggle present on the other machines is totally absent here for some reason, so you're stuck with the provided frame rate caps here. Okay, so that's a lot of information to take in, so let's summarise. Hogwarts Legacy is generally fine on PlayStation 5 in performance terms, but the Xbox consoles need some serious work at the moment. The incredible volume of visual modes also seems perhaps excessive for a console game. PlayStation 5 and Series X effectively have a whopping 9 discrete modes, without much guidance to help novice players navigate these options. Weighing people down with this many choices, well, it's great for Digital Foundry, but for the average user there's an argument that this vast wealth of options strays from the principles of the easily accessible console experience, especially given that some of them have some serious issues. Loading times though, I'd say that they're pretty brisk across all consoles, though the world is a little more divided than you might expect. Technically, Series X and PlayStation 5 don't feature loading screens during most open world traversal, but some doors take a few seconds to open with a little 2D loading animation visible while you wait. Xbox Series S takes this one step further, with an actual loading screen popping up when travelling between Hogwarts and the broader open world. And maybe this is a concession to accommodate the Xbox Series S's reduced memory pool. So, Hogwarts Legacy does a great job of capturing the visual appeal of the film franchise, and let's be clear here, Avalanche Software has built an exquisitely detailed world that translates the aesthetic of the films into a fully playable game experience. On that level, this is one of the most accomplished film adaptations we've seen to date, giving you that visceral experience of interacting with, or perhaps even feeling like you're inside a movie. The game itself is perhaps a bit less inspired than its visual presentation. You'll spend a lot of time simply talking to characters, engaging in simple minigames and watching cutscenes, at least in the early game. Combat is a relative high point, but it's fairly straightforward as well. If you don't have a serious appreciation for the source material, a lot of the game is not especially appealing, though fans are bound to be pleased. It's not a clean bill of health in performance terms either, with troubling frame rate issues on Xbox consoles, which hopefully can be addressed in due course. Now that's not to say that PlayStation 5 is perfect on the other hand, but it's clearly substantially more stable across its main visual options. Upcoming releases for PS4, Xbox One and Nintendo Switch, which are all penciled in over the next few months, present more profound challenges. Seriously scaled back visuals seem like an inevitability, but the game seems to present performance problems across a wide range of settings already. It's a bit hard to see how a game that struggles this much on current gen hardware would be a success on systems with a small fraction of the CPU power. Ultimately, Hogwarts Legacy is a beautiful, expansive piece of fan service with a level of visual accomplishment that's likely to seriously impress those deeply into the wizarding world. From my perspective though, it's difficult to reconcile a game that looks this good with the range of performance issues it has on the Xbox consoles. And I think what's needed in that case is a good degree of extra polish to deliver the kind of complete package users should expect. All of which brings us to the end of this video, so please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed it, and of course there's bell ringing for allegedly instant notifications when new content quote unquote drops on the channel. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching.